Hey everybody, my name is Keith Matejka from Thunderworks Games out of Madison, Wisconsin. I am a designer first, now a publisher, and basically, 6 years ago I started this little company, kind of the result of me getting into game design and wanting to publish my own titles. And I wanted to kind of talk through a variety of topics, but a lot of it is focused on like why I decided to start my own game publisher, whether that was a real conscious decision or not, or if it's just kind of how it worked out, and some of the pitfalls of being a publisher and things if that's something you're interested in doing. As a lot of people know, maybe they don't know, but there's kind of a lot of times in my experience of becoming a game designer, you start coming up with this great design, you're really confident about it, and then you hit this fork in the road when you decide like, okay, I'm gonna try to get this licensed by another publisher and kind of just be a designer, or am I gonna kind of control this thing till the end and like bring it to market, which is like a whole different set of skills and different set of knowledge that you have to have. So that's the path that I decided to take, some of you may be considering that as an option, or at least be aware of like all the difficulties or some of the great benefits of being a small publisher that you decided to forego and decided to kind of just stick to design and focus on coming up with cool ideas. So a little bit about me. A lot of this talk will be kind of focused on kind of what I've done in the last 6 years in my experiences, but obviously if you have questions that come up along the way, feel free to speak up or raise your hand or whatever. I'm happy to answer questions mid presentation, but there'll also be time at the end. So I started out as a game designer, just kind of getting together with buddies, coming up with designs, meeting with local game designers, going to proto-spiels, that kind of stuff. And so now I publish my own stuff. I publish other designers' works, and I also, maybe foolishly, design things for other publishers. So if you're not familiar with kind of me or my work, here's some of the stuff that has been published by Thunderworks to date. So Role Player is kind of my big title that's been through, is currently entering its 6th printing and has been a real success for me. And then some of the other Role Player related stuff, the most recent two being Lockup and Cartographers at the end. But the one in the bottom in the middle is Bullfrogs, and that's kind of the game that kind of kicked off board games for me. There's also a couple of other titles that I did. I did recently a game called Skull Hollow for Pencil First Games, and I've done some solo design for some other publishers, including Pencil First, but who cares about that stuff? So if you want to, the question is like, starting a small publisher, like why would you want to do that? That sounds like an awful idea, right? So there's a bunch of work, a lot of knowledge, a lot of problems, but though a lot of exciting things about kind of taking this cool idea that you've written your rule book for, you've refined the gameplay, and then taking it to the next level. One of the decision points that sometimes designers start going down the wrong path on sometimes is they've got this great game, and even though they intend to try to find a publisher for it, they start investing in artwork. And that's a little bit of a slippery slope because if you start going down that avenue, you have to be aware that if this ends up getting picked up by a publisher at some point, there's a pretty good chance that that's all getting thrown away. So maybe that artwork helped you get that deal signed, but you have to be aware that when that game eventually gets on the shelf, which maybe 2-3 years after a publisher decides to sign it, that artwork probably won't be in the game. Or you maybe have a totally different theme, or there'll be some changes along the way because some developer got a hold of it and did some refinement. And kind of one of the reasons why you might want to go into publishing your own stuff is so that you get to control all those things, right? So you get to take your baby, you get to do all your own art direction, you get to, the opportunity to run a Kickstarter. Potentially, that's what I did. Of all the titles that I've done, they've all been funded through Kickstarter except for one, which is my most recent one. And we can kind of talk about, if people are interested, why I decided not to use Kickstarter for my most recent project. But, or kind of most recent. But, so why would you want to become a publisher? Because you get to maintain control. But it also means you get to take on all the risk, right? So that means you're investing your own money into your project, you're marketing your own game, you're entering this area of publishing that you probably don't have a lot of experience in, and you have to wear a ton of different hats, whether it be sales, marketing, logistics, which if you're here for Kirk's thing can be very overwhelming, and then just kind of owning this product for a long time. So, and that's the path that I chose, mainly because at the time there was kind of all these guys coming up on Kickstarter. Jamie Stegmaier was telling the whole world how to do Kickstarter, and James Matthew was there offering lots of advice. And I saw all these people being successful, and I said, foolishly, that doesn't look so hard. I could probably do that. So, and at the time, I had a full-time job, and this was something that I was like, oh, I'll just do this on the side. It'll be fun. Initially, I decided let's figure out what my goals are. So goal number one was start small. Pick a small game that has low complexity for manufacturing, right? That doesn't necessarily talk about the game complexity in terms of how difficult it is to play or how long it is or anything, but just like the component quality or component quantity, cost of manufacture, keep these things low. Mainly because I don't know anything, right? So let's minimize risk, right? Especially because we're talking about my personal funds. The first game that I had been working on was like this big elaborate mega map with miniatures and tons of chits and 40 decks of cards and all this stuff, and I was just looking at it saying, this is going to be like an $80 game on Kickstarter. I'm going to be a first-time creator. Who would get on there and back some new guy with this massive project? So that game went to the shelf, and I said, what is the most interesting small package kind of game I can work on? So that's kind of where my Bullfrogs game came from. So the goals were to keep the risk of the project low so I could have a small funding goal and still have a successful project to make this game. The idea was to just learn as much as I can, and that's one of the goals in life, I guess. It's like I'm a guy that asks a lot of questions. I'm doing lots of research. If I hear about anything, I'm Googling about it, trying to talk to people who have experience. Hang out with them because you're going to learn a lot and you're going to do better at what you're trying to get done. And then that's like doing something small was like an achievable target. So I mentioned before, Kickstarter was where I was focused. Kickstarter is a fantastic platform. People talk about Kickstarter because it removes risk, it pushes it out to backers, but also the thing that I like most about it is it's this huge marketing machine. There are thousands of hungry board gamers looking for something brand new that are going to Kickstarter. And there wasn't so much back in the day, but I would say that's even more so now. And so that was going to be one of my marketing tools in addition to social media, but it also was a big risk reducer for me. So I have some experience in project management and stuff in the past, but I kept telling myself that at the end of the day, if this thing doesn't fund, doesn't seem like there's interest, I'm willing to kind of scrap and start over. And so one of the reasons I use Kickstarter was to kind of reduce that risk, to minimize that from happening. Because the last thing I want to do is invest a bunch of money into a product and have a garage full of 2,000 copies of this game that nobody wants. And I have a good friend in the Madison area that has that, and it's been 5-6 years, and he still has trying to give these copies away of his game that nobody wants. So I don't want to be that guy. Anyway, so one of the kind of mantras was to treat, even though this is a hobby, this is my full-time job, but to treat it like a job. So I would have, specific times of the day, I have my full-time job, and I have my family time, and then 8 p.m. to 1 a.m. is Thunderworks time, and I would lock that away like every day for years, just trying to figure out what the heck I'm doing and just push forward wherever I can. And then social media is a super important marketing tool, and that was kind of, it's an easy way to get information out to people that for a small guy on a tight budget can use pretty effectively if you're smart about it. And then I was trying to figure out like ways to, how do I differentiate my company from somebody else's company? Make great games, everybody says that, right? So, so I mean, and I was looking to my peers and seeing what they were doing, and Jamie Stegmeyer in particular was someone that I really looked up to, and I liked the way that he was treating his customers, and I kind of took that on as something I wanted to do. So yeah, building a fan base, meeting, like you're doing demos at conventions, meeting people that are fans of your stuff, interacting with people, reaching, on a personal level, reaching through the screen, being a personable dude. Those are kind of things I wanted to do. So, so these were things like as I started moving forward, these were things I was thinking about. I guess I want to back up a little bit. When you think about, hey, do I want to make a game publisher? Do I become a game publisher? Like, I didn't really talk about the more technical things in terms of like, hey, I need an EIN, and hey, I need to register my name with I need to like become an official company with the state of Wisconsin or whatever. And those are all things that if you just, you decide to start a business are relatively pain-free. I think when I did it, it was like $60 and a website. Within like 15 minutes, I had an EIN and official documentation, and I officially had a limited liability company. So then at that, going through that process is really simple. And then in addition to that, you do stuff like making sure you have a bank account for your business so that you can keep your money separate. Things like that help you track your expenses so that it's not all mixed together with your personal stuff, so you can figure out what you're spending and have a specific place for revenue if you end up getting it. So those are kind of important pieces for kind of running a business and like starting one. We can talk about that more if that's of interest. But anyway, I'm just going to keep running through this. So eventually, as I was kind of doing board games, and I had, my first initial release was fairly successful, and then I started learning a lot more. So I was able to kind of do not just one project a year, because that was my initial idea. Of like, there was there's these two guys in Europe that were doing like one game a year at the time. It was like Snow Tales is theirs and like Savannah Tales. So they were doing like one game at a time. And I kind of liked that model. It's like I can kind of create these time chunks of something I'm going to work on, and I know I don't have to worry about anything else. But I kind of learned enough. And then as game production, kind of the intensity of it goes down, especially after the Kickstarter is over, and you've figured out all your logistics, and you're somewhat kind of waiting for the factory to get done with the product or shipping it. You've got some downtime to kind of start ramping up on new projects. So that's what I started doing, working on multiple games a year. I started picking up designs from other designers. Sometimes it would be like, well, I don't know what other game I'm going to make. I don't have a great design laying around. I don't have any great ideas, but my buddy showed me this great game, so let's try to do somebody else's game. So I kind of started branching into working with outside designers, and that has another kind of learning process with it as well from a publisher perspective. The writing contracts for designers, like there are some resources out there, and having a lawyer is helpful. But I'm cheap, and a lot of that kind of stuff I end up reusing existing stuff, or kind of probably this is a bad idea, is like inventing my own language for some of these agreements. But just kind of working with designers, figuring out like, oh, like, okay, if I'm a publisher and there's a designer that I want to sign their game, how do I figure out how much that person gets paid or how they get paid? And does the way I do my accounting make any, like, how much work is it going to be to do all the accounting to pay this person? So there's all these kind of really not fun thought processes you have to go through. But kind of once you've done it once, it becomes easier. And so one of the things that I listed on the previous slide, which was talking about find other creators and network. This is huge. There's a lot of people that are going on Kickstarter that are starting these smaller publishers that are hitting the same problems that you would be hitting. So, and in general, the game design community is like pretty friendly, I would say. And so I ended up finding all these other creators that were coming up at the same time that I was, and we would bounce questions at each other and be like, oh, I solved this problem, and it's like, but I have this other problem, and it's like, oh, I have an answer for that one. So you end up kind of building these relationships with other people that are facing similar problems as you are, and you can really benefit from that kind of communication. So there's a lot of people out there in the board game industry that are happy to help you if you know who to ask and have the right question to ask. So I definitely encourage that kind of, just building relationships. So I was a little bit late to the convention scene. I know there's especially when you have a full-time job and you're doing this on the side, it's hard to carve out, weekends to do conventions if you have, a 40-hour work week and potentially family as well. But that is definitely something that people, I encourage people to do, is take their games to conventions to start to build awareness, start to build relationships with people, because once they've played it with the creator, then they have a positive experience with that game. When you come around to Kickstarter or you go straight to retail, they're going to remember you and they're going to want to help you out. Especially when you are getting off the ground, there's going to be a bunch of people that want to help you, and which is very kind. But take advantage of those things if you can, and then as you grow, you build more relationships, and there's even more people that want to help you do stuff. So one of the things as a small company gets a little bit bigger after your first game is done or whatever, you start to figure out this workload is massive. Like, what of this stuff do I not like doing? And then you find people to do those things for you. So whether it be somebody helping you out on social media, somebody helping you, obviously I'm not an artist, so I've got my artist contractors and my graphic designers. I do a lot of licensing of my titles to other publishers, so that's other international publishers, so that's another revenue stream that I've created for myself, where I say, hey, Pegasus Spiel, I've got this game called Role Player, like, you guys want to do it in German, I send you the files, you send me some money, and everybody's happy. So that kind of work will happen, or those kind of requests for people to partner with you will happen once you have like a published game. And they take a lot of time. So much that it sometimes feels like the money isn't worth the effort. But like, I have found a partner that can manage and negotiate all those deals for me. So I want to engage in that financial space, but I don't want to do it. So I got my friend. So she's taking care of it for me. So there's those kind of, as you get more and more overloaded, you find opportunities to focus on the things that you want to do and find other people to help you out with the stuff that you don't. But some of the other things, when I was starting a publisher, I just was using my own personal money. I didn't like go and get a loan or anything like that, because getting a project ready for Kickstarter can cost quite a bit. Specifically, you can cut a lot of corners by finding friends and stuff, but at the end of the day, art is expensive. Graphic design is probably more important than illustration and is a lot more work and can be really expensive as well. And I think that can be a surprise to people sometimes, because that person is also doing file prep for printing in addition to touching like the way everything looks in your game. And if you can learn those skills yourself, they can save you a lot of money, but it probably won't save you a lot of time. And at the end of the day, I see a lot of early creators, they have something that they've done themselves and they're very proud of the fact that they've saved all this money. They either taught themselves how to draw or they're learning InDesign and getting really good at it. At the end of the day, you have to look at your products and compare them to the things that are on the game shelf, right? So if your game is sitting next to the latest Fantasy Flight release and your game looks okay, you're probably not going down the right path. So when it comes to art, spend the money for, you know, world-class talent, I would say, because artwork sells games. You know, we are visual beings, and if you're going to sit looking at something for 2 hours, it's got to look awesome. So that's kind of just a random tip. And then, so as I started to grow, I started running into these problems where I had a game, it was on Kickstarter, I got it back, it went into distribution, and then there's all these time delays. So the game goes on the store shelf. I go through what's called a consolidator, who my stuff comes from the factory to a consolidator. I use impressions, and then they sell into distribution, and then they sell into the retail store, and then they sell to the customer. So there's all these steps along that chain. So when the games come in and they hit my consolidator, he sells them, and then they sell them, and then they sell them, and there's all this money delay of me getting my money back. So once the game is in the shelf and somebody buys it, it might be 60 to 90 days before I get my copy, and then until I get my money, and then but the game's been sold out for a month, and everybody's hammering, like saying, we need more copies, we need a reprint, and you're like, well, I could start one in 3 months, and then it's going to take 6 months for it to turn around, and then you don't know if the demand's there when it finally arrives. So there's kind of the small business liquidity problem, where it's like sometimes you just need cash just to kind of kickstart the next thing, not literally, not Kickstarter.com, but to move the next thing forward. So I ended up reaching out to my financial institution at some point and like getting a revolver loan in which I have a significant line of credit that I can float to get the next product out while I'm waiting for the money from the previous product to come back in. And that's been really helpful to let me be a little bit more agile and get the things done I want to get done. But so as a personal note on my story, in the last year and a half, I was moved to full time, so I'm able to put out more games every year. So, which has its own set of scary things about it. I mean, that's to a lot of, I think, early game designers, that's the dream, is to be a full-time game designer. I think being a full-time game designer is really tough. I think being a full-time publisher is obviously possible. There's a lot more risk being a publisher, but there's a lot more upside as well. You know, at the end of the day, the designer doesn't make, on a very successful game, the designer usually doesn't make that much money. The publisher does, but they're also the ones that took the risk on the project financially. So I think if I had stuck to going back to the beginning of the parting of ways, whether like design only or become a publisher, I feel like I took the publisher route, and I worked really hard, but I also got lucky, and as a result, I've been able to go full-time making games because I made that choice. Whereas then if I decided, hey, I'm going to try to get Z-Man or somebody to publish my Little Frog game, you know, I probably would have been able to sign it, but I probably would still be at my full-time job typing emails and doing cool stuff, but I wouldn't be able to kind of own all the stuff that I do. So I think that's pretty much it. Do you guys have any questions? Sir, in the back.
Yeah, I don't know if you know the decision to go publisher, one of the things that kind of can happen is you get less design time. So as a full-time publisher, do you regret any of it from the design?
Right. So the question is basically, okay, if you go into publishing, you know, how much time do you get to spend designing anymore? And I find that the further I get into publishing, it becomes harder and harder to find time to focus on design. So then it becomes like one of those things. You try to find more stuff that you don't want to be doing, and you find other people to do that for you. I mean, obviously paying them and building that relationship so that you can lock away time to work on design. And some of that comes from having regular meetups where I meet up with designers and I've got ideas and I get to share ideas because I really like the collaborative design process. But it becomes a challenge. And I would say last year I probably didn't do as much design as I had liked to, but that's something that I'm trying to keep an eye on and try to make sure I'm still designing stuff. Because if I wanted to kind of forego that, I could definitely fill my 60 to 80 hour week with publishing stuff, no doubt about it. Anything else? What's up?
When would you recommend starting to build your social media presence in relationship to like, I don't have any solid games right now, but I will later.
Sure.
Or like, yeah, in like 2 months I'm gonna have something. That's when we're really gonna start hitting the social media.
Right.
And all that.
So there's kind of the social media for. So the question was like, how soon should you be building your social media presence? I don't know are you thinking more like about a game you're working on, or like building it about like your company?
I guess more in terms of like a company. Like I don't have anything physically right now.
Right.
But like it could be like another 2 years before like I actually have a game, or is it like I got 2 months before we're gonna start. The Kickstarter goes live or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't, sorry, the clarification was more about the company and like how soon in comparison to when the Kickstarter is going to go live. So I would definitely, at the very beginning, at least in my experience, would just like focus on the game, get the game going, and then every time you're playtesting, write down everybody's name who playtested. And I mean, if you can collect their email addresses, that's cool too. But some people don't like to fill that out, and I get that too. But be visible with your game. I don't think getting your Facebooks and your standard website up. I think these are great things to be doing. You can post, do blog posts. Blogging is people like that. I think blogging is probably less prevalent than it was 5 years ago, but I think it's still important. But I mean, you can still you can use that as a design diary for the project that you're using, and you can create content on your website, and people will get into following that. And you can tell people that we're kind of logging what we're doing on our website, and people might check it out. The thing is, like, if you don't have a whole lot to show, then it kind of feels like, well, why do I have this? But having it, like, at least the bones of it there and starting to fill it with content, it's good to be in place so that as you ramp up, you're like, oh yeah, we got to get the website together. Like, it's already there, and I've had time to refine it and get in a good spot. So
I know an important element for being successful with crowdfunding and things like that is to get some sort of name recognition. Is it a risk-adverse way then to license a few titles to maybe get that with less risk involved, or is it harder if you're leasing or licensing a game to have that come back to you rather than kind of the publisher getting the credit?
Right. So the question was about name recognition and kind of building up a brand, kind of either probably as a designer, whether it makes sense to license games to publishers, and then maybe once you've established your brand, maybe pull it back and start self-publishing. I don't see that a whole lot. Usually a designer either just loves designing and that's what they want to focus on. I have seen some publishers, I've talked to some designers that they get a handful of games out and then they're like, I want to be making more money. And so then they're like, well, maybe I should start considering self-publishing. I haven't seen anybody kind of go through with that, and they're still kind of focused on design because that's where their passion is and probably where their talents are. Because publishing takes a lot of, it pulls from a lot of different areas in terms of skill set. So I would say, I guess I wouldn't do that. I mean, obviously I didn't do that, so I'm biased that way, but I'm trying to imagine like a Ryan Lucat from, help me out, who's doing like Sleeping Gods and all that stuff. Like if he had started out designing for other people and then ended up bringing in-house, I feel like you should figure out what you want to do and just target that instead of like kind of going back and forth. In terms of like notoriety and brand, I think that just comes with time. You kind of show that you can do something that people enjoy. Once you have success breeds success to some degree. So just, I would focus on building the brand, doing the thing that you want to do. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I got. What's up?
If you're comfortable sharing it, what as a percentage of your revenue comes from your international licensing agreements?
Probably less than 10%. International licensing deals, there's a couple different ways to structure them. I do the least time-intensive one, which has the least amount of profit coming out of it. So I sign an agreement. They say they want to do my game in their language. I send them the files. They find their own printer. I get an advance, and then usually I get paid a royalty on their sales, either quarterly or annually or whatever, depending on how they do their accounting at their company. But there's no real policing. It's really hard to police them. If they say they sold 2,000 copies, but they really sold 4,500 copies, I have no way to figure that out really. So there's some trust that goes on there. US is the biggest market for sure. Germany is a big market, and Italy's pretty big, and Poland is growing. But as you probably know, when you run a Kickstarter, 50% of your sales are going to be in the U.S. And a lot of those sales, well, the ones in Canada are going to be your version anyway. So the number of potential sales I don't think is great per language. So I don't make a ton of money on it, but I usually get $1,000 advance, and then depending if they sold 1,000 copies or 5,000 copies, I might get $3,000 or $4,000 a year on top of that. But so role players in 11 languages at this point. So if you can stack them like that, it definitely makes an impact. The other ways to do international licensing is that you say, hey, Poland, you want my game? That's cool. You're going to pay for the translation, and then you're going to pay for basically, I'm going to give you a price per unit I'm going to sell them to you at. You're going to give me half of that up front, which is actually going to pay for the manufacturing. And then they're going to figure out the logistics of getting it from the manufacturer to their destination. And then they pay me the other half, which to me is all profit. And you can make a lot more money doing it that way, but you have to deal with working with the manufacturer, getting the translated files, potentially working with a graphic designer to relay out cards and rule books and boxes. And then there'll be an approval process of okay, here it is, you guys are cool with this. So managing that methodology takes a lot more time, but you can make more money. Whereas I want to spend my time making my games. I don't really want to spend my time making a Polish version of Role Player, even though it's going to make me some money. That's just why I choose to do it that way. There's another scenario where I could hire somebody to kind of manage those for me, and then I could make more money on internationally licensed stuff that would pay for that person's hours plus more money than I would have licensing it with just the files. But that's an equation that I've never tried to figure out what the answer is to yet. So it's kind of one of those things where hey, this system works, so I'm just going to keep doing it this way and work on other stuff. Miss Heather, what's up?
Is it for you all just about if you can make money or not with the foreign translation, or is there a part of you that's gratified to know that your game is internationally known?
Right. The question was for international licensing stuff, is it what's the motivation? Is it only to make money, or is there some inherent value in seeing your game in multiple languages and feeling good about that? I think both are true. There's also an additional element of a German version of your game getting released creates more conversation online about your game, which will then drive additional sales of the US or the English release version. So there's that benefit. But in terms of what's my personal relationship with these products in multiple languages, I think initially when I was my first 2 or 3 products, it was more about oh man, it's cool that my game is in Spanish and Italian and German. And and then I get like samples of these copies, and they're like filling my walls with with all these like foreign language versions of your games. And then you're like, I'm running out of space. Like, I don't really want these things. Like the sheen of it kind of wears off a little bit. So you're like, it's cool, but like I'm much more excited about the new product that I've been working on with my buddy or whatever. Some like new gameplay mechanic I came up with or whatever. Yeah.
Do you think it has an impact on how you're seen by the gaming community, like the clout that you have, the fact that you've gone international? Do you think it has an impact on your brand?
I don't think so. I mean, when I see, if I see a game in another language, like I don't think particularly more highly about the game because it's in another language. I guess internally I just have this assumption that most games eventually make it to other languages, and sorry, the question for the online viewers, the question was like, I'm trying to process it.
Do you think it impacts your brand?
Right.
Do you think people see your brand as having more clout?
Right. Is my brand seen more positively online when they see that title is published in additional foreign languages? I don't really think so.
Gets you more groupies.
Sure. Any other questions, you guys? Yeah.
So especially as a smaller publisher, do you find it difficult at times to balance publishing, like self-publishing your titles, or publishing titles from other designers?
Yeah, 100%.
Balancing that?
Yeah, so the question is, how do you balance publishing your own stuff and publishing other designer stuff? Right now, it's kind of like I have these reactive policies, so it's like originally I was publishing my own stuff, and I didn't really have anything lined up, and I wanted to work on something new. So I kind of picked up a designer's thing, another designer's product. Some of it turns into like I like going to protospiels and I see people's designs, and sometimes I see something that's really awesome, and it's like I can't help myself but like saying I want to make this game, even though I didn't design it. I do get scared that someday I'm going to be publishing 80-90% of other people's designs versus my own. So I've kind of, as a result of doing 2 or 3 games in a row from other designers, I've kind of decided, okay, I'm getting nervous about pushing too far in that direction because I want to keep my design chops sharp, and I like design. So then I just said, okay, well, we're going to do about 50% of my own and 50% of other people's stuff. There's also this drive to, as a publisher, keep releasing stuff, right? You got to feed the machine. The money still has to come in. I still got to pay my medical insurance and put food on the table. So I can't like go 2 years without releasing something while I'm twiddling away on some small design. If I have something, I'm going to prioritize that over somebody else's design. But if I don't, then I can slide in somebody else's thing too. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. What's other?
Why did you say that it might have been foolish for you to design like Skull Hollow?
Sure. So the question is, why did I say it was maybe foolish to design Skull Hollow? So it kind of relates to that comment. So Skull Hollow I designed for Pencil-First Games, who's owned by Eduardo Baraf, who is a friend of mine, and he's one of those guys that kind of came up. He was like a little bit further ahead of me in terms of like people coming into publishing, and I asked him a lot of questions. He's doing cool stuff that I wish I was doing, so I'm asking him questions, reaching out, and we kind of became friends. At some point, he asked me to design some single player stuff for him, which were small, kind of one-off, like where they flat fee gigs that I felt like I had time to do. And then he asked me to work on this bigger game, and the promise was I was working my full-time job, and I was like, well, I could design this game and then I don't have to do any of the publishing stuff. That's like 10% of the work is the design, right? So yeah, that'd be cool to work on another game. And then a bunch of stuff happened in terms of Role Player kind of blew up. I was able to quit my job and focus on games full time. So then this game came out after Thunderworks had kind of boosted quite a bit. So, and why I said like maybe that wasn't a good idea, it was a good idea because my friend asked me to do it and I liked working on it. But it was probably a bad idea like financially. So like we said before, most of the risk, well, really all the risk is on the publisher, but all the, a lot of the proceeds are as well. So Skull Hollow does really, really well. I'll do pretty good. But like Ed, as the publisher, is going to do a lot better. So at the end of the day, if I had taken that design and put it under Thunderworks and I had taken the risk on it, I would have benefited. So that's why, business-wise, maybe it wasn't the greatest decision, but at the time, it was the right decision. I'm glad I worked on it. I'm continuing to work on it. And I like working with Ed and that team too, so. Cool. Well, we'll do here. What's up?
So you mentioned thinking about having a hard time deciding how to pay developers and doing a flat fee for the one that you did.
Sure.
Can you talk a bit about how you decide how you're going to
Pay designers?
pay developers and
Okay.
what range maybe?
Yeah, so he's asking about how do you decide how much to pay designers, and he also mentioned developers, which is something different, right? So when I talked about how like as I got busier, I was kind of off, I was sending things to other people. One of those things is development. So I've had the luxury to, as you guys know, like those last 5% of the game, getting the game super polished is like a ton of work. And I don't like that finalization polish piece, I don't like as much as some of the other pieces, so I was able to kind of pass that off to an outside developer. And so, a small project for a developer, I usually pay a flat rate. Can it be anywhere between, I don't know, $1,000 to $4,000, I would say, depending on the size of the project. I mean, if it's, depending on like the amount of playtests it's going to take to get everything polished, and if they're going to be providing ideas for Kickstarter stretch goals, or if they're, depending on how big their playtest groups are and how many playtests they're going to run, you're going to be paying around there, but that's usually a flat fee. When you're paying a designer, meaning you're kind of licensing that design, I mean, there's kind of an industry standard. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts about this. I mean, people pay either on the wholesale price of the product, which is usually considered 40% of the MSRP, because retail gets their 50% and distribution gets their 10%. So a lot of times people get a percentage of that, and then there's a whole list of deductions of like things that they can choose not to include in that, like any kind of promotional copies that they give away or demo copies they give out. So usually a designer will get in advance against future royalties. The way, just because I hate accounting, which I do have an accountant, but there's a lot of stuff that I have to do myself. I structure my deals a little bit differently, in which mine are, the designer gets, I don't know, 6, 7, 8% of wholesale of every copy manufactured, instead of, and it's based on basically when the games are made, I pay that out instead of waiting for them to be sold and then paying the designer kind of piecemeal after that. So they're getting paid on more copies and they're getting paid sooner, but they're usually getting paid less per copy from Thunderworks Games titles than somebody else's. Mainly because I can just look to figure out how many copies I'm going to manufacture and know exactly how much I'm going to owe. And then I don't have to send quarterly statements to this dude. I can just be like, here's your money. I'll let you know if we're going to print again. So that's kind of how I run it. There are other structures that people use. Another common one, it's not super common, but you see it sometimes, where a designer will start getting paid a much higher percentage once all the expenses, or like a percentage of the expenses of publication are covered. So it's basically like, hey, I took all the risk, I get to cover all my expenses first, and then when like we're hitting profit time, we're gonna split it like more like 40-60 or 50-50 across the designer and publisher. And so that's a great deal if you have a hit. If you don't have a hit, you're like making nothing, right? So that's that. Question in the back?
Yeah, you mentioned getting serious about conventions.
Right.
evolution. And I'm curious whether either then or now, or it depends whether conventions for you are a profitable enterprise or whether you sink money into that and hope it comes out in exposure
Right.
or audience growth or whatever.
Right. So where do you put the value financially on a convention, right? So initially, I didn't go to a lot of conventions because I was busy. And like people say, go to your conventions and play your game and get the word out. I think those things are true. You always have to measure like how much your time is worth and how far it is and all the expenses involved with going to a convention that you're not selling anything at. So as a publisher, I held off on going to conventions until I had a product to sell. So I could have a booth and I could like make some money, or at least have the hope to make some money or break even at least. And now I've got, so I waited till Bullfrogs came out, but I sold out like pretty quickly. So then I didn't have copies to sell for the next 6 months, so I didn't do conventions. And then Role Player came out and it sold out really fast, and I didn't really have copies to sell at conventions, so I didn't really do them. I waited until I knew I was going to have product to sell. So at this point, I've done Gen Con, have a booth there twice. Previously, I'd go to Gen Con just to do the first exposure playtest hall, which is of value from a designer and even as a publisher perspective. But in terms of paying that $1,200 or $1,500 for that booth, for the 10x10 booth that you might get, unless you have something to sell, it's a pretty hefty price tag to have to pay for marketing, because there's a lot of ways you can market your game and your company that don't cost that kind of money. And I started small. You know, my first convention that I was doing was Gamehole Con here in Madison, where I didn't have to get a hotel and I could drive there every day. You know, you try to find those kind of things. But then I've also done a lot of like small shows, and I get there and I set up a table, and you know, 3 people walk by in the first 4 hours, and you're like, I'm just like killing my time here. Like there's no value here. So trying to figure out like which ones are worth going to and not to, we've been kind of exploring that, and like, oh, this one wasn't worth it, we're not going to do that one next year. So for me right now, the profitable ones, Gen Con is a big profitable one for sure. I'm making money at that show, no doubt, and Origins as well. And then PAX Unplugged is also a big, you know, not big, but pretty good money maker for me. Like it's definitely worth going out. I'm walking away with a profit for sure. You know, the alternative of like just pushing things through distribution and sitting at home and working on more games and letting the money come in, you know, that's another way to make money. You just have to decide whether you're a convention person to some degree, or having that presence at conventions is worth it to you. I think there's a ton of benefit to being at conventions, not only just like selling product and you know, trying to, you know, get people to play your game, but you do a lot of networking, meeting other publishers who are, like I said before, of like solving the problems that you're trying to solve, and you can get a shortcut to those solutions. Or like, yeah, I've got this guy that does this thing. It's like, oh man, I could totally use that guy. And also conventions are fun, you know, if that's your personality. So I don't know if that covers your question. Yes, you.
So once you've produced your game and gotten it to your consolidator,
Right.
how do you generate sales? Are you selling mostly wholesale and it goes to stores? Do you
Right.
have to
Sure.
promote the game?
So the question is like, how once your game's complete and at your consolidator, how does the game sell, or how does it get in the customer's hands, and what's your role as a publisher, right? So when I was talking about the consolidator, I kind of skipped the step of like going to a fulfillment house to fulfill your Kickstarter obligation, and then the remainder going to your consolidator. It's just like as a general note, at least when I was starting out, whatever copies I needed for Kickstarter, because I had lined up consolidation into distribution, I would assume I'm going to need maybe double plus a 500 to go into distribution. So part of the fee that you pay for that consolidator is, because he gets his cut too, is he's going to help market the game to distribution. He's going to be sending out emails saying, hey, this game is coming, and has some basic stats about it, and encourage distribution to order copies. And some people's response to that, like once they get to that point, are like, okay, I'm done. Like it'll just magically work into distribution, and it'll probably sell some. But in reality, you have to push the product. So that means I'm sending out review copies to people and getting the timing right so that those are coming out. I like to have reviews coming out right as it comes out, or at least a little bit later, so people can see a review and they're like, oh, that looks cool, I want to buy this. And then they can buy it immediately instead of like, oh, here's a review of a copy that's coming, of a game that's coming out in 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, I'm going to forget all about that game and have something else to buy. So I'm sending out review copies. I'm also, sometimes I'll buy some Board Game Geek ads or something like that, but especially with a Kickstarter project, there's kind of two phases. You know, there's like the media blitz when it's on Kickstarter because you want everybody to pledge their money, and then when it comes out in retail, a lot of that budget is spent, or publishers have kind of moved on, and a lot of times customers have kind of moved on and need to be reminded, like, hey, here's this cool thing that you didn't get around to pledging last time, but now it's available. So sometimes I'll do some Board Game Geek ads or something like that. And there's a bunch of information about, I don't know if anybody's advertised on Board Game Geek before. I'm assuming you're familiar with Board Game Geek, but there is a cool opportunity to get what feels like free advertising on Board Game Geek, which is giving them things for them to sell in their store. So like if you have a game, I know JT was talking about components. If you have a sheet of cards, sometimes it's good to keep one or two of those free, so you can like throw in a promo card that you can have separated, and then you can send them to Board Game Geek, and they sell them to their customers, and then you get advertising credit from Board Game Geek because their advertising is pretty expensive, especially for a small publisher. But like for example, all the ads that I ran for the second expansion, Fiends of Familiars, for Role Player on Kickstarter, I think I spent over $8,000 in advertising on Board Game Geek for that, but I had enough credit to cover that whole thing. Yeah, it did cost money to manufacture those cards, but because they were manufacturing the cards anyway, the cost that it takes to separate that card and shrink wrap it up and throw it in a box is pretty minuscule. So I hope that answers your question. What's up, JT?
How do you value industry-only shows versus, consumer
Right.
oriented shows like Gamma or
Right.
ACD Games Day?
So yeah, the question is like, how do you value like a consumer-facing show versus an industry show? So Gamma is the big one. So Gamma is the professional organization for the board game industry, and that's going to include manufacturers, and that's going to retailers and distributors, and that happens in Reno every March. You guys are good. So that's a industry-facing show, and then there's like 5 large distributors within the U.S. and some smaller ones, but the larger ones tend to have game days where they invite retailers to come, and publishers are there kind of showing off wares of things that are coming out soon, and those are all kind of, I'm not selling to a dude who wants to play my game. I'm saying, hey, you're a store, check out this new game that's coming out. You got to make sure that you have this on your shelf to sell to your customers. So they're in a show like that, people are interested in MSRP, like the product code, what's the size of the box, how many pieces per case. Like they're much more about, these are boxes to put on my shelf that I can sell to my customers. And I say the value in those shows is even less tangible than a consumer-facing show. Like a consumer-facing show, I can go to Gen Con and I can like, hey, we sold 700 copies of Cartographers. That means, we made X amount of dollars. And I can compare that to the expenses for lodging and all that other junk. With Gamma, there's no, you're not gaining any money for going to these shows, but you're building relationships, which has a ton of value, which you can't put a number on. So if you can afford it, I think it's worth going. But as a small publisher, I didn't start going until the 3rd or 4th year I was doing this. I would say focus on making an awesome game and trying to market that as best as you can. And then sometimes this other stuff will come later, especially because I didn't have the money to go to that show, and I couldn't get time off work to go to that show. And it's like, I was like, my focus was on trying to sell it. And then eventually you start to open your eyes, like that retailer that is a fan of your game, that is setting up demos and building games nights around your game and knows your game better than any other game in their store, they can sell a ton of copies. You know, like, so I look at local stores, there's, if there's one store really knows the game and they put it on display and they can move 60 copies of it. And the other one who's like, oh, it's another box, and they put it on the shelf, they sell 3 copies. It's like having an advocate in a store for your game is huge. And how do you create, those advocates is by making a personal connection with them at a show like Gamma. Or, this show is great. The ACD Games Day, which happens here in town, in this very building. That's a great show to go to, at least to walk around, to like introduce yourself to people, see what people are doing. Because one, it's local. If you're here, I'm assuming you're somewhat local. And it's short. It's not a super long week. You get the opportunity. They take volunteers here. You get the opportunity to kind of go into the ACD warehouse and kind of see behind the scenes of like, what does a board game warehouse look like? And there's a lot of things to learn by going to those kind of things. So if you can go to them, go to them. But especially when you're first starting out, if you can't afford it, there'll be time down the road. Will?
So why didn't you go Kickstarter for
Cartographers? So yeah, I made a reference of one of the titles that was on that list. I didn't go to Kickstarter. So I was getting a little nervous because I had been using the same manufacturer for all my titles, and I had kind of done this Kickstarter route for all these projects. There is kind of a big mental overhead. If anybody's ever run a Kickstarter before, there's a big mental overhead for running a Kickstarter. Like, some people say it's soul sucking, but there is so many expectations. Gamers have huge expectations. You're doing the best you can, and there's all these opinions flying at you. There's all this logistics. You have to have the right answers for all these questions. You're online all the time, and it's tough. Running a Kickstarter is not easy. So I was like, hey, what if I did a game that wasn't on Kickstarter? Like, could I do it? And then I had this small game, this $25 box. Like, if we went straight to retail, like, it's not as much of a risk. I was like, well, and then my other thing was like, I've been using Panda for 6 games at the time. I was like, I feel like having all my eggs in one basket when it comes to manufacturing. I'm gonna try somebody else. So this seemed like the perfect project. The components weren't complex. There's a pad of paper, a deck of cards, and a couple pencils. So it was kind of the experiment project. And it was interesting. Like, I decided I'm gonna go straight to retail, and I kind of showed it to some people, and people started to get excited about it. And they're like, hey, where can I pre-order this thing? And it's like, I guess I'm taking pre-orders on my website. So then, because I have my own website and I use Big Cartel for my e-commerce, and I was like, oh, I'll just throw it up there, and as the orders come in, I'll just put them in an Excel sheet, and when the game's done, I'll ship them out. The other thing why I didn't want to do Kickstarter is like, Kickstarter takes 10% or 9.5%. I'd like to keep that money. And then when it comes to Kickstarter, people, at least I think, either expect a significant discount on that product that you have on Kickstarter or some exclusive content. And because retail is a big deal for me, like, I make a lot of money in retail, I definitely respect that platform, is that I don't want to do exclusive stuff. Because not only like having the product for the retailer be the same as what they got on Kickstarter, because retailers run into this situation where like people who buy games don't want to buy from them. They'd rather buy it from Kickstarter because they get the exclusive stuff. And I like game stores. And the other thing is like when someone buys a game and then they discover, oh, there's a Kickstarter version that's cooler, like it gives them kind of this negative experience. It's like, I don't want people to have that experience with my games, so I don't do exclusive stuff. So I usually discount the price 20%. But by doing these outside of Kickstarter, I just charged MSRP, and people were willing to pay for shipping. So I just put it on my website. But there was a lot of attention on it. So, and it's like, well, if you have a page on your website, Now I gotta create a how to play videos because people want to know how it's played. And then reviewers start contacting me saying, hey, is there a review copy? Which is nice that people are interested in your titles. But the whole idea was like, this is supposed to be kind of low effort game turned into like 60% of a Kickstarter without having those thousands of Kickstarter eyeballs on it. So I think in the end, I got quite a few, pre-orders on it on my website, but if it had been a Kickstarter project, I would have probably had thousands. But then when the game came out, like when I talked about those 2 phases of marketing, like I hadn't spent that first phase. So it comes, like there was a little bit of hype from like the alpha gamers about the title. And then when it hits retail, there's a bunch of people that this is a brand new thing and I can run some ads about it. It's not like, oh, that game was on Kickstarter last year. It's like, oh, this is out, this is brand new, this is cool. So I was kind of able to build some marketing and some interest in it that way. So in the end, not doing Kickstarter, I think it's a tough call. If you asked me 6 months ago, I would have said I wouldn't do it again. Like just the marketing power of being on Kickstarter is huge. So now we're talking about maybe doing some more Cartographers stuff. So it's like, okay, is this going to be a Kickstarter product or not? I didn't last time, but I also think expansions do well on Kickstarter. So an expansion Kickstarter, you can leverage all the stuff you had from the base game, and then it's a great jumping on point for people who heard about the game, and they can kind of get in with the base game and the expansion. So we'll see. So I'm not sure yet, but I think we probably will. But I would like to do more stuff outside of Kickstarter, especially since I'm trying to do more titles. Whereas initially I was doing 1 title a year, then I was kind of doing 2 titles a year. Now I went full time. I'm doing 3 or 4 titles a year. So that means, you can't put all these things on Kickstarter because then they're all like staggered, and backers get upset. They're like, oh, he hasn't delivered for this last 3 projects, and it's like, well, it's because I did 4 different Kickstarters in the last 6 months, and it kind of Kickstarter trust starts declining. So it's kind of I'm at a point that I have the capital and like I've succeeded to a certain degree in which I can not do Kickstarter and kind of pick and choose which ones are good fits for that platform and which ones aren't. I'm getting a watch. I'm going to wrap it up. Any last questions?
How is Cartographers done in your eyes?
Great. I mean, if Roleplay was my hit, Cartographers is right behind it at this point. The initial print run of Cartographers was 8,000 units, and that's pretty much gone. So I've been able to reprint. So that's like that's the golden chalice for any publisher. If you get to reprint, that means you're probably actually making some money. So that's cool. All right. Well, I'll be around to answer questions, and thanks for listening.